What happens when a proud shepherdess accidentally exposes herself to a wandering Apache warrior and ancient law demands they marry on the spot? When Clara Hayes declares, "By the law of my people, you must marry me," to the very man who just saved her life. She has no idea this split-second decision will ignite a love story that defies every boundary of race tradition and a town hell-bent on tearing them apart. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible 2-hour journey and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The morning sun blazed merciless across the Wyoming territory, casting long shadows over the rolling prairie where Clara Hayes drove her flock through knee-high grass. Her father's sheep moved in lazy clusters, their bells creating a gentle symphony that had become the soundtrack of her solitary life. At 23, Clara possessed the kind of fierce independence that made neighboring ranchers shake their heads and whisper behind weathered hands, "That Hayes girl ain't natural," they'd mutter over coffee at Morrison's General Store. Living out there all alone since her pa died, talking to sheep like they're people. But Clara didn't care what they thought. She had her land, her flock, and her father's last words echoing in her mind like a sacred commandment. "Clara girl, remember what I taught you. If a man ever sees you uncovered, your hair loose, your dress torn, your modesty compromised, by the law of our people, he must marry you. It's protection, child. Don't you ever forget it." Old Samuel Hayes had been a man of rigid Baptist principles, shaped by generations of Scottish settlers who believed that honor and shame walked hand in hand. His daughter had inherited his stubborn streak along with his peculiar interpretation of biblical law, a mixture of Leviticus and mountain justice that would have made any scholar scratch their head in confusion. The sheep bleated softly as Clara adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, tucking rebellious strands of auburn hair beneath its protective shadow. Her calico dress, faded from countless washings, bore the patches and stains of honest work. She carried her father's Springfield rifle with practiced ease, its weight as familiar as breathing. "Come on, ladies," she called to the flock, her voice carrying across the open range. "Water's just over that ridge." She had no way of knowing that 3 miles to the east, 5 men with murder in their hearts were studying her through a spyglass. "Look at that," sneered Jake Mullins, lowering the instrument from his eye. His face bore the pockmarked evidence of a hard life lived harder. Little Shepherdess all alone with her woolly friends. "Easy pickings," agreed his brother Tom, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Sheep'll bring good money in Cheyenne, and that rifle of hers looks mighty fine." The Mullins gang had been terrorizing the territory for months, hitting isolated farms and ranches with ruthless efficiency. They favored targets that couldn't fight back, old men, women alone, families with small children. Clara Hayes and her flock represented exactly the kind of easy score they preferred. "What about the girl?" asked Billy Crane, the youngest of their group at barely 19. His voice cracked with nervous excitement. Jake's smile revealed teeth stained brown with tobacco. "What the bosses don't know won't hurt 'em. We'll have our fun, then leave her for the buzzards." They mounted their horses and began the descent toward Clara's position, confident in their numbers and firepower. What they couldn't have anticipated was the lone figure watching them from the opposite ridge. Ronan Blackhawk had been tracking the Mullins gang for 2 weeks, not for any bounty or legal obligation, but for reasons far more personal. They had raided a peaceful Arapaho camp 3 weeks prior, killing 2 elders and stealing horses. Among those horses had been Thunderwalker, a magnificent paint stallion that belonged to Ronan's deceased brother. At 28, Ronan moved through the world like smoke, present one moment, vanished the next. His Apache mother had taught him the old ways of reading sign and moving silent as shadow. His Irish father, a cavalry deserter who'd found love and redemption among the tribes, had given him green eyes and a stubborn streak that matched any Celtic warrior. Now those green eyes narrowed as he watched the 5 riders spread out in classic hunting formation, converging on the unsuspecting woman below. Ronan had no particular love for white settlers. Too many of his people lay buried because of their endless hunger for land. But there was something about watching predators stalk an innocent that stirred ancient codes of honor in his blood. He urged his horse down the slope, moving fast but quiet, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a born hunter. Clara heard them before she saw them, the thunder of hooves growing louder by the second. She spun around, rifle coming up to her shoulder in one smooth motion, just as 5 riders crested the small hill behind her flock. "Well, well, well," called Jake Mullins, reining in his horse about 30 yards away. "What have we here?" The sheep began to scatter in panic, their bells creating a chaotic clamor. Clara kept her rifle trained on the apparent leader, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You men turn around and ride on," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I've got nothing you want." Jake laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Oh, I think you do, darling. I think you've got everything we want." Tom Mullins began circling to her left, while Billy Crane moved right. The other 2 hung back, blocking any escape route toward the distant hills. It was a well-practiced maneuver, one they'd used dozens of times before. "Now you can make this easy or hard." Jake continued, his hand resting casual-like on his pistol grip. "Easy means you put down that rifle and let us take what we came for. Hard means—" He shrugged eloquently. "Well, hard means you won't be around to tend these sheep no more." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "I said ride on. Feisty little thing, ain't she?" Tom called out with a grin. "I like 'em with some fight." The rifle blast echoed across the prairie as Clara fired over their heads. A warning shot meant to make them reconsider. Instead, it only made them laugh harder. "Girl can't even shoot straight," Billy hooted. "My turn," Jake snarled, drawing his Colt .45. The world seemed to slow down in that moment. Clara saw the sunlight glint off the barrel of his pistol, saw his finger begin to squeeze the trigger, saw her own death reflected in his cold eyes. Then the air filled with the sound of war cries and thundering hooves as Ronan Blackhawk burst over the ridge like something out of a fever dream. He rode low on his horse's neck, a Winchester rifle in his hands, his black hair streaming behind him like a battle flag. The ancient war paint on his face, red and black stripes that spoke of the old ways, made him look like a spirit of vengeance given flesh. His first shot took Jake's hat clean off his head. His second shattered Tom's rifle stock before the man could bring it to bear. His third sent Billy Crane diving from his saddle to seek cover behind a boulder. "What the hell?" Jake shouted, trying to control his spooked horse while bringing his pistol around to target this new threat. Ronan's horse wheeled and pivoted like it was dancing, keeping the rider in constant motion while he worked the lever action of his rifle with deadly precision. The 2 men who'd been holding the back positions suddenly found themselves caught in a crossfire with Clara's Springfield barking from one direction and the Apache warrior's Winchester speaking death from another. "Let's get out of here," one of them yelled, spurring his horse toward the distant tree line. "Stand and fight, you cowards!" Jake roared, but his own horse had other ideas. The animal panicked by the gunfire, and the smell of blood reared up on its hind legs and sent Jake tumbling into the dirt. Tom Mullins, seeing his brother unhorsed and the situation deteriorating rapidly, made a desperate charge at Clara. His logic was simple: grab the girl, use her as a shield, fight their way clear. But he'd forgotten about the sheep. Panicked animals scattered in every direction, and Tom's horse stepped into a prairie dog hole at full gallop. Horse and rider went down in a tangle of limbs and screams, the horse's legs snapping with a sound like a gunshot. Billy Crane broke from his cover, running for one of the riderless horses, but Ronan's next shot kicked up dirt inches from his boots and sent him diving face first into a patch of prickly pear cactus. In less than 3 minutes, the Mullins gang had been reduced from predators to prey. Jake struggled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, to find himself staring down the barrels of 2 rifles. "Drop it," Clara ordered, her voice steady now that the immediate danger had passed. Jake's hand hovered over his holstered pistol. "You think you've won something here? We know where you live, girl. We'll be back." "No," Ronan said quietly, his green eyes cold as winter ice. "You won't." Something in his tone, a finality that spoke of unmarked graves and circling buzzards, made Jake's hand move very slowly away from his weapon. "You're making a mistake, Apache," Jake snarled. "Protecting white folk will get you hung." "Probably," Ronan agreed with a slight smile, "but you won't be around to see it." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Clara made a decision that would change everything. "Go," she said simply. "All of you. Take your wounded and your dead horse and get off my land. But know this, if I see any of your faces again, I won't fire warning shots." Jake's eyes burned with hatred, but he knew when he was beaten. He helped Tom to his feet. The man was favoring his left ankle, probably sprained in the fall. Billy extracted himself from the cactus, looking like a human pincushion. The other 2 men had already vanished over the horizon. "This ain't over," Jake promised as they limped toward the surviving horses. "Yes, it is," Ronan said with quiet certainty. They watched the remnants of the gang disappear into the shimmering heat haze, leaving behind only scattered sheep, the smell of gunpowder, and 2 strangers who had fought side by side without even knowing each other's names. Clara lowered her rifle and turned to study her unlikely rescuer. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, his dark skin gleaming with sweat, those startling green eyes taking in every detail of the battlefield. The war paint on his face was already beginning to streak in the heat. "Thank you," she said simply. Ronan nodded once, already turning his horse to leave. His work here was done, and lingering around white settlements was never a good idea for a man with his heritage. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he wheeled his mount around, Clara moved to gather her scattered flock. One of the ewes, an old matriarch named Bessie, had been grazed by a stray bullet and was bleeding from a shallow wound on her flank. Clara knelt beside the animal, murmuring soothing words as she examined the injury. It was then that disaster struck. The combination of adrenaline, heat, and sudden relief made Clara dizzy. As she stood up too quickly, her vision swam and she stumbled backward. Her heel caught in a gopher hole, sending her tumbling toward a jagged outcrop of rock. Ronan saw it happening and reacted without thinking. He threw himself from his saddle, landing hard and rolling, coming up just in time to catch Clara before her skull met stone. The impact of her body against his sent them both sprawling, with Ronan taking the brunt of the fall. For a moment they lay tangled together in the dust, both breathing hard from the shock of it. Then Clara became aware of several things simultaneously: the warmth of strong arms around her, the scent of sage and leather, and something indefinably masculine, and the fact that her carefully pinned hair had come completely loose in the fall. Auburn waves cascaded around her shoulders and across Ronan's chest like liquid fire. Her hat had gone flying, and the top buttons of her dress had come undone in the tumble, revealing the pale skin of her throat and the lace edge of her chemise. Their eyes met and held, green fire meeting brown earth. And in that moment, something electric passed between them. It was Clara who broke the spell first, scrambling to pull her dress closed and gather her hair with shaking hands. Oh Lord, you," she stammered, her face flushing red as barn paint. Ronan sat up slowly, brushing dust from his buckskins. "You're not hurt." "No, You saved me twice now." She managed to get to her feet, still clutching at her loosened hair. "I don't even know your name." "Ronan," he said, simply rising with fluid grace. "Ronan Blackhawk." Clara Hayes." She paused, looking at him with something like wonder and something like terror. You saw me." "I saw you fall. I saw you in danger. I acted." His voice was careful, neutral. "No." Clara's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You saw me, my hair, my—" She gestured helplessly at her still disheveled dress. "By the law of my people, if a man sees a woman uncovered, compromised, he must marry her." Ronan stared at her for a long moment, certain he'd misheard. "I beg your pardon." Clara's chin came up with the stubborn pride that was her hallmark. Color burned in her cheeks, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "My father taught me the old ways, the biblical ways. If a man sees a woman's hair unbound, her modesty compromised, he has taken something that cannot be returned. Honor demands, the law demands. Marriage!" Ronan finished, his voice flat with disbelief. "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. They stood facing each other in the aftermath of violence, surrounded by scattered sheep and the lingering smell of gunpowder, while the enormity of what Clara was suggesting settled between them like a thunderclap. Ronan's first instinct was to laugh. His second was to mount his horse and ride hard for the horizon. Instead, he found himself studying this strange white woman who spoke of biblical law and ancient codes as if they were living things. "You don't know me," he said finally. "I could be an outlaw, a killer, a man with a dozen wives already." "Are you—" The simple question hung in the air between them. Ronan considered his options. He could lie, could invent any number of sins to discourage her from this madness. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "No, I'm a tracker, a hunter, a man caught between two worlds who belongs fully to neither." He gestured at his face, where Irish features warred with Apache bone structure. "Your people would call me a half-breed. My people sometimes call me worse." Clara's eyes never wavered from his. "What do you call yourself?" "Alone," he said simply, something in that single word. The weight of loneliness, the acceptance of exile, the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to carry his burden without complaint, touched something deep in Clara's heart. She had been alone too ever since her father's death, alone with her sheep and her rigid code of honor and her stubborn pride. "My father always said that God moves in mysterious ways," she said softly. "Maybe he brought you here for a reason. To save you from the Mullins gang. Maybe, or maybe—" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Maybe he brought you here to save us both." Ronan was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he would simply mount his horse and ride away, leaving her to deal with the consequences of her father's strange interpretation of biblical law. Then he spoke, and his words changed everything. "If I said yes to this madness, if I agreed to this marriage, what would that mean? What would you expect?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had thrown out the challenge without fully thinking through the implications. Now, faced with the reality of it, she found herself scrambling for answers. I have land, a cabin. The sheep bring good money at market. I can cook and keep house, and I wouldn't expect—" She stumbled over the words, her face burning with embarrassment. "That is, I wouldn't demand. The marriage could be in name only, if that's what you wanted. And if it's not what I wanted—" The question was asked quietly, but it hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked at this man who had appeared like an avenging angel to save her life. This stranger with green eyes and gentle hands and a voice that did strange things to her heartbeat, and suddenly the idea of sharing more than just a name didn't seem terrifying at all. "Then we'd cross that bridge when we came to it," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. Ronan studied her face for a long moment, reading the courage and fear and hope written there in equal measure. He thought of his brother dead 2 years now in a cavalry raid. He thought of the empty miles he'd traveled since then, moving from place to place like smoke never belonging anywhere or to anyone. He thought of Jake Mullins' promise, "This ain't over." Men like that didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. Clara Hayes would need protection whether she realized it or not. And maybe, just maybe, he was tired of being alone. "All right," he said, and watched Clara's eyes go wide with shock. "I'll marry you, Clara Hayes, by your law and mine." The words seemed to echo across the prairie, binding them together with invisible chains stronger than iron. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief and terror in equal measure. You will, I will." Ronan held out his hand, palm up. "But we do this right. Apache custom says that when a man takes a wife, he must prove he can provide for her and protect her. I've already shown I can fight for you. Now I need to show I can work for you." Clara stared at his outstretched hand. Taking it would seal their bargain, would bind her to this stranger in ways she was only beginning to understand. But when she looked into his green eyes, she saw something that made her decision easy. She saw kindness. "Deal," she said, and placed her small hand in his larger one. The handshake that sealed their engagement was firm and brief, but Clara felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers, the warmth of his skin. It was the first time a man other than her father had touched her, and the sensation sent an odd shiver down her spine. "So," she said, trying for lightness to cover her nervousness, "what happens now?" Ronan looked around at the scattered sheep, the trampled grass, the evidence of the morning's violence. "Now I help you gather your flock. Then we go to your cabin and figure out how two strangers are going to become husband and wife." It took the better part of 2 hours to round up all the sheep. Some had scattered nearly a mile in their panic, and one stubborn ewe had gotten herself tangled in a thicket of wild roses. But working together, Clara and Ronan managed to collect the entire flock and start them moving toward the distant smudge of smoke that marked Clara's homestead. They walked in companionable silence, the sheep flowing around them like a woolly river. Occasionally their hands would brush as they worked to keep the flock together, and each contact sent a little jolt of awareness through Clara's system. She found herself stealing glances at her unexpected fiancé, trying to reconcile the fierce warrior who had appeared like something out of legend, with the quiet man walking beside her now. The war paint had been wiped away, revealing features that were strong without being harsh, handsome in an utterly masculine way that made her stomach flutter with unfamiliar sensations. "Can I ask you something?" she said, finally breaking the comfortable silence. "Ask. Why did you help me? I mean, really, you could have just ridden on." Ronan was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. 2 years ago, my brother was killed in a cavalry raid. He was trying to protect the women and children of our camp when a soldier put a bullet in his back. He paused, his jaw tightening. "I wasn't there. I was off tracking stolen horses, playing at being useful, while my family died." Clara felt her heart constrict with sympathy. "I'm sorry. Ever since then, I've been drifting, looking for a purpose, I guess. When I saw those men stalking you, saw the way they looked at you like you were prey." He shrugged. "Maybe I was trying to save my brother by saving you. Maybe I was just trying to save myself." The honesty in his voice, the raw pain he was allowing her to see, humbled Clara completely. This man had opened his heart to her, had shared his deepest wound with a stranger. The least she could do was reciprocate. "My father died 6 months ago," she said quietly. "Fever took him fast, and I wasn't ready. He'd been my whole world, you see. Mama died when I was 12, and it was just him and me and the sheep. He taught me everything, how to read, how to shoot, how to survive on my own. But he also taught me to be afraid. Afraid of what? Of men. Of the world beyond our little valley, of depending on anyone but myself." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And here I am asking a complete stranger to marry me because of some half-remembered lesson about biblical law and feminine honor." Having second thoughts. Clara considered the question seriously. Was she having second thoughts? Certainly what she was doing was insane by any reasonable measure. She was proposing to bind herself legally and spiritually to a man she'd known for less than 4 hours based on an obscure interpretation of scripture that most people would dismiss as frontier foolishness. But when she looked at Ronan Blackhawk, she didn't see a stranger. She saw the man who had risked his life to save hers. She saw someone who understood loneliness and loss, who carried his pain with dignity, who had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than most people showed in a lifetime. "No," she said firmly. "No second thoughts. You—" Ronan's smile was small but genuine. "None." They crested a low rise, and Clara's homestead spread out before them. It wasn't much to look at: a small log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that had seen better days, a corral that needed mending, and a vegetable garden that was more hope than harvest. But it was home, and Clara felt a flutter of pride as she showed it to the man who would soon be her husband. "It's not fancy," she said, suddenly conscious of how rough and primitive it must look to outsider eyes. "It's beautiful," Ronan said, and meant it. After years of sleeping under stars and sheltering in whatever cave or abandoned building he could find, the simple homestead looked like paradise. "Your father built this, him and me together, took us 2 summers working evenings and weekends when we weren't tending the sheep." Clara's voice warmed with memory. "He always said a man's home should be built by his own hands with help from those he loves." As they drove the sheep into the corral and secured the gate, Clara found herself wondering what her father would think of the day's events. Would Samuel Hayes approve of her strange interpretation of his teachings? Would he welcome an Apache son-in-law, or would his frontier prejudices override his religious principles? She had no way of knowing, but as she watched Ronan repair a loose board on the corral with quick, sure movements, she thought her father would have respected any man willing to work for what he wanted. "Clara," Ronan said, straightening from his work, "we need to talk about the practical aspects of this arrangement." Practical aspects. Marriage, even a frontier marriage, requires certain formalities. A preacher witnesses legal papers, and then there's the question of how we present ourselves to your neighbors. Clara felt her cheeks warm. In all her romantic fantasizing about her unusual proposal, she hadn't given much thought to the mundane realities of actually getting married. "There's a circuit preacher comes through about once a month, Reverend Thompson, and as for neighbors," she gestured toward the distant smoke of other homesteads, "most folks around here mind their own business." "What about supplies? Food, ammunition, winter clothing? If I'm going to be your husband, I need to know what kind of shape your finances are in." The practical questions helped ground Clara in reality. This wasn't some romantic fairy tale. It was 2 people agreeing to share their lives, their resources, their futures. The romance, if it came at all, would have to grow from that foundation. "I do all right," she said. "The sheep pay well, and I've got money put by from the last 3 market runs. There's a root cellar full of vegetables, and I preserve meat from the hunting. We won't be rich, but we won't starve either." Ronan nodded approvingly. "And weapons? The Springfield, a shotgun, and my father's pistol, plus plenty of ammunition." "Good. You'll need to be armed at all times from now on." At Clara's questioning look, he explained. Jake Mullins meant what he said about this not being over. Men like that don't forget a humiliation, and they don't let debts go unpaid. They'll be back probably with more men. A chill ran down Clara's spine despite the warm afternoon sun. How many more? Hard to say. The Mullins gang has been growing over the past year. Could be 8 or 10 men all told. Can we handle that many? Ronan's smile was grim but confident. If we're smart about it, yes. If we're stupid, we'll be dead within a week. The blunt assessment should have terrified Clara. Instead, she found it oddly reassuring. Here was a man who didn't try to shield her from harsh realities, who respected her enough to tell her the truth, even when it was frightening. "What do you suggest? First, we make this place defensible. Board up windows, create firing positions, stockpile supplies. Then we let people know we're married, make it official and public. A married woman has more legal protection than a spinster, and a man protecting his wife has more community support than a stranger helping a neighbor. Clara nodded slowly. It made sense from a tactical standpoint, but it also made their strange arrangement feel suddenly real and permanent. And after that, we learn to live together. We figure out how to be husband and wife, how to make this partnership work. Ronan's green eyes searched her face. That's assuming you still want to go through with this. Clara looked around at her small homestead, at the man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. In a few hours, she would be preparing supper for two instead of one. In a few days, she would no longer be Clara Hayes, spinster shepherdess. She would be Clara Blackhawk, married woman. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a strange sense of rightness, as if all the lonely years had been leading to this moment, this choice, this man. I want to go through with it, she said firmly. The question is, do you? Ronan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the edge of the small yard and stood looking out over the rolling prairie. Clara watched him, noting the way he held himself with unconscious grace, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for threats, the way the afternoon light caught the blue-black highlights in his hair. When he turned back to her, his expression was serious but settled. I've been alone for a long time, Clara. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth coming home to. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I can't promise to love you. Not yet. Love is something that grows, if it grows at all. But I can promise to honor you, to protect you, to work beside you, and build something good together, if that's enough for a start. It's enough, Clara said, and discovered she meant it completely. It's more than enough. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming territory, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Clara Hayes and Ronan Blackhawk shook hands once more, sealing their agreement to become husband and wife. They were still strangers in most ways that mattered, but they were no longer alone. The shepherdess and the Apache warrior stood together in the gathering dusk, neither knowing what the future would bring, but both finally ready to face it with someone worth trusting at their side. The first night passed in awkward politeness, with Ronan insisting on sleeping in the barn despite Clara's protests that the cabin had a perfectly good spare room. She lay awake long past midnight, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving around her property. The soft nickering of his horse, the creak of barn timbers, the occasional cough that reminded her she was no longer alone in the world. When dawn broke gray and cool over the prairie, Clara found Ronan already up and working, reinforcing the corral fence with salvaged timber. He moved with quiet efficiency, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal powerful forearms marked with small scars that spoke of a life lived hard. She watched him from the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast, wondering what thoughts occupied a mind that seemed constantly calculating angles and distances. "Coffee's ready," she called from the doorway, her voice carrying easily across the small yard. Ronan straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Smells good." They sat across from each other at the small table her father had built, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken question. Clara had cooked for two out of habit, then realized she had no idea what this stranger liked to eat. Ronan approached the simple meal of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with the careful courtesy of a man who had learned not to take food for granted. "This is excellent," he said after the first few bites. "Thank you. My father always said the way to judge a woman's character was by her cooking and her shooting." Clara smiled ruefully. "You've seen me do both now. Both impressive." Ronan's green eyes held a hint of amusement. "Though I hope I won't need to test your shooting skills again anytime soon." The easy comment broke some of the tension, and Clara found herself relaxing slightly. "What about you? Can you cook?" "Trail cooking. Nothing fancy, but it won't kill you." He paused, then added with surprising honesty, I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Clara. I won't be a burden to you. Something in his tone suggested this was important to him, that he not be seen as taking advantage of her offer of shelter and respectability. Clara felt a flutter of understanding. Pride, it seemed, was something they both possessed in dangerous quantities. "I never thought you would be," she said simply. After breakfast, they fell into the work of the day with surprising ease. Clara tended her sheep while Ronan continued his systematic fortification of the homestead. By noon, he had created 2 concealed rifle positions that commanded clear views of the approaches to the cabin, reinforced the doors with extra timber, and begun the process of stockpiling water barrels in case of siege. Watching him work, Clara began to understand that her strange marriage proposal had bound her to a man who thought in terms of warfare and survival. The casual way he planned for violence should have frightened her. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. After a lifetime of her father's protective warnings about the dangers that lurked beyond their small valley, it was reassuring to have someone who took those dangers seriously. "Ronan," she said during their midday meal, "can I ask you something personal?" He looked up from his plate, waiting. "Yesterday, when you charged those men, the war paint the way you fought, that wasn't just strategy, was it? That was personal." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the wooden table. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. 3 weeks ago, the Mullins gang raided a peaceful camp. They killed 2 elders and stole horses. One of those horses belonged to my brother. He met her eyes directly. "So yes, it was personal." "Your brother, the one who died?" "The same. Thunderwalker was his favorite mount, a paint stallion with eyes like liquid fire." Ronan's jaw tightened. "My brother raised that horse from a colt, trained him with patience and kindness. To see him used by men like that." Clara felt her heart constrict with sympathy. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "How could you?" Ronan shrugged, but she could see the pain he was trying to hide. "The point is, our paths crossed for a reason yesterday. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was chance. Either way, I'm glad I was there." "So am I." The words came out softer than Clara had intended, carrying more weight than simple gratitude. Their eyes met across the small table, and for a moment the careful politeness fell away. Clara saw the loneliness in Ronan's gaze, the way he held himself slightly apart even in conversation, as if expecting to be rejected at any moment. She wondered if he could see the same careful distance in her own eyes, the protective walls she had built after too many years of solitude. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Both of them were on their feet instantly, Ronan's hand moving to the pistol at his hip, while Clara reached for the rifle she now kept propped beside the door. "3 riders," Ronan said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon, "coming from the east." Clara's heart hammered as she recognized the familiar figures. "It's all right. It's the Morrison brothers and Doc Henley, neighbors." Ronan's hand didn't move away from his weapon. "You trust them?" The question made Clara pause. She had known the Morrison brothers and old Doc Henley for years, had traded with them and shared community gossip and considered them as close to friends as her isolated life allowed. But trust real, trust the kind that meant safety in a crisis. "I think so," she said finally, "but stay alert." The 3 men rode into the yard with the easy confidence of longtime neighbors, but Clara noticed the way their eyes lingered on Ronan with obvious curiosity and poorly concealed suspicion. Jim Morrison, the elder of the brothers, was a weathered man in his 50s who ran cattle on the range north of Clara's property. His brother Pete was younger and harder, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. Doc Henley, despite his nickname, was actually the local blacksmith, a gentle giant who had earned his title by being the closest thing to a medical expert within 50 miles. "Afternoon, Clara," Jim called out, touching his hat brim in polite greeting. His gaze flicked to Ronan and lingered there. "Heard there was some excitement yesterday. Thought we'd ride over and check on you." "I'm fine, Jim. Thank you for coming." Clara kept her voice steady, but she could feel the tension radiating from Ronan like heat from a forge. "This is Ronan Blackhawk. He helped me drive off some trouble." "Blackhawk," Pete Morrison said, making the name sound like something distasteful. "That's Indian, ain't it?" The silence that followed the question stretched taut as barbed wire. Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger at her neighbor's rudeness, but before she could respond, Ronan spoke. "Apache," he said simply, his voice carrying no defensiveness or apology. "And Irish." "Half-breed," Pete muttered loud enough to be heard. Doc Henley shot his companion a sharp look. "Pete, what I'm just saying, what we're all thinking. Clara's got a half-breed Indian camped on her property, and yesterday there was shooting. Seems like trouble follows his kind wherever they go." Clara felt her temper flare white-hot. "His kind saved my life, Pete Morrison. While you and your brother were safe at home, this man risked everything to help a stranger." "So that's as may be," Jim Morrison said diplomatically, "but Pete's got a point about trouble. Word is the Mullins gang hit the Peters place 2 days ago. Burned out their barn, stole their horses. Sheriff thinks they might be working this whole area." "They already tried here," Clara said flatly. "Ronan ran them off." "How many?" Doc Henley asked, his professional curiosity overriding social awkwardness. "5, Ronan answered. "Jake Mullins, his brother Tom Billy Crane, and 2 others I didn't recognize." The 3 neighbors exchanged glances. Pete Morrison's hostility was replaced by grudging interest. "You faced down 5 armed men?" Jim asked. "We did," Clara said firmly, emphasizing the plural. "Together." Doc Henley's weathered face creased into an approving smile. "Good for you, girl. About time someone gave those bastards what they deserved." He looked at Ronan with new respect. "Military experience." "Some," Ronan said noncommittally. "Well, whoever you are, mister, you did good work yesterday." Doc extended a massive hand. "Any man who'll stand up to the Mullins gang is all right by me." Ronan shook the offered hand, but Clara could see he remained wary. Years of prejudice and rejection had taught him to be suspicious of sudden acceptance. Jim Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. "Clara, can we speak privately for a moment?" Clara's jaw tightened. "Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of Ronan." The hesitation before she found the right word didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. Pete Morrison's eyes narrowed with renewed suspicion. "Your what, exactly?" he asked bluntly. Clara felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. She could deflect the question, could maintain the fiction that Ronan was simply a helpful neighbor or temporary hired hand, or she could take the leap that would change everything, that would make their strange arrangement public and permanent. She looked at Ronan, saw the careful neutrality in his expression, and realized the choice was entirely hers. He would support whatever decision she made, would play whatever role she assigned him. The knowledge of that trust, that he was placing his reputation and possibly his safety in her hands, made her decision easy. "My husband," she said clearly. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Doc Henley's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Jim Morrison's mouth fell open slightly. Pete Morrison looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Husband," Jim finally managed. "Clara, how did you? We never heard anything about you getting married." "Yesterday evening," Clara said, the lie coming surprisingly easily. "After Ronan saved my life, we decided life was too short to wait for perfect timing." Doc Henley was the first to recover his composure. "Well, I'll be damned. Congratulations to you both." His grin was genuine and warm. "Quick courtship, but I suppose when you know, you know." Pete Morrison was less gracious. "This is pretty damn convenient if you ask me. Stranger shows up, there's trouble, and suddenly Clara's married to a half-breed. Seems suspicious." "Nobody asked you, Pete," Doc Henley said sharply, "and I'd watch my mouth if I were you. Man's got a right to defend his wife's honor. The warning was delivered mildly, but everyone present understood the implications. Ronan's hand rested casually near his gun, and his green eyes had gone cold as winter ice. "No offense intended," Pete said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just seems sudden, that's all." "Love often is," Clara said, slipping her hand into Ronan's. His fingers closed around hers automatically, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Ronan and I have known each other for, well, it feels like forever." The physical contact sent an unexpected jolt through Clara's system. She had initiated the gesture for show to convince their neighbors of the marriage's legitimacy. But the warmth of Ronan's hand, the way his thumb automatically stroked across her knuckles in what seemed like genuine affection, made her heart race with something that felt dangerously real. Jim Morrison studied their joined hands with thoughtful eyes. "Well, if you're happy, Clara, then we're happy for you. Your pa always said you'd know your own mind when the time came." "Thank you, Jim. That means a lot." "Suppose we should be heading back," Doc Henley said, gathering his reins. "Got to spread the word about the new Mrs. Blackhawk, is it?" "That's right," Clara confirmed, though hearing her new name spoken aloud made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. After the neighbors had ridden away, Clara and Ronan stood in the yard, her hand still clasped in his. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and for a moment the illusion of marital happiness seemed almost real. "Well," Ronan said finally, "that's done. By sunset, everyone within 20 miles will know you're married to a half-breed Apache." Clara heard the bitter edge in his voice and turned to face him fully. "Do you regret it? What I said?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face. "Do you?" "No," Clara said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. "I don't regret it at all, even though I haven't been entirely honest with you." The admission sent a chill down Clara's spine. "What do you mean?" Ronan released her hand and walked to the edge of the yard, staring out at the endless prairie. "I told you I was a tracker, a hunter. That's true as far as it goes. But I didn't tell you I was cavalry, Union Army during the war, scout and tracker for Colonel Morrison's regiment." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Morrison, as in Jim and Pete's older brother, yes. David Morrison was my commanding officer for 2 years. Ronan's voice was carefully controlled. "Good man, fair to his scouts, respectful of tribal customs. He was killed at Little Bighorn." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Her new husband had served under her neighbor's brother, had fought alongside white soldiers against his own people's interests. The complexity of it, the divided loyalties and impossible choices, made her head spin. Does Jim know? Not yet. But he will eventually. David wrote letters home, mentioned his scouts by name. It's only a matter of time before Jim puts the pieces together. Clara sank down on the porch steps, trying to process this new information. What will happen when he does depends on the man Jim is. Some folks can accept that a man might fight for survival rather than principle. Others, Ronan shrugged, others see any cooperation with the cavalry as betrayal. "What about your people? How do they see it?" The question clearly pained Ronan. "My mother's people, they see a man who chose the white man's war over tribal loyalty. My father's people, they see a half-breed who was never really one of them anyway." His smile was bitter. "I told you I was caught between two worlds, Clara. This is what I meant." Clara studied his profile, noting the way he held himself rigidly upright, as if bracing for rejection. The lonely pride in his posture, the careful distance he maintained, even while sharing his deepest secrets, broke her heart. "I don't care," she said simply. Ronan turned to stare at her. "You don't understand. When this comes out, and it will, you'll be married to a man both sides consider a traitor. Your reputation, your standing in the community." "I said I don't care." Clara stood up, moving to stand directly in front of him. "Do you think I'm some delicate flower who'll wilt at the first sign of gossip?" Do you think I've lived this long on the frontier without learning to fight for what I want? Clara, no, listen to me. She reached out and grasped his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles. You think I care what people say about the man who saved my life? You think I'm ashamed to be married to someone who's faced impossible choices and tried to do the right thing as best he could see it? Ronan's eyes searched her face, looking for signs of doubt or disgust. Instead, he found fierce loyalty blazing in her brown eyes like banked fire. You don't know what you're saying, he said quietly. You don't know what it's like to be despised by everyone. Don't I? Clara's laugh held no humor. I'm a 23-year-old spinster who talks to sheep and quotes Bible verses most folks never heard of. I live alone on a remote ranch and shoot better than most men. Trust me, Ronan Blackhawk, I know exactly what it's like to be different. They stood facing each other in the fading afternoon light, two people who had found unexpected understanding in the most unlikely circumstances. Slowly, Ronan's rigid posture began to relax. We're quite a pair, aren't we? He said softly. The Shepherdess and the Apache. Clara agreed with a small smile. Sounds like the beginning of a very strange story, or the end of a very normal one. That evening they shared their second meal together with considerably less awkwardness than the first. The public declaration of their marriage had somehow made their arrangement feel more real, more permanent. They were no longer two strangers testing the waters of an impossible bargain. They were husband and wife, for better or worse. There's something else we need to discuss, Ronan said as Clara cleared away the supper dishes. What's that? Sleeping arrangements. Clara felt her cheeks warm. In all the practical considerations they had discussed, this most basic aspect of married life had somehow been overlooked. The barn is fine for now, Ronan continued, but if neighbors start visiting or if the preacher comes calling, it's going to look strange that a married man doesn't sleep in his wife's house. Oh, Clara hadn't considered that aspect of maintaining their cover. I suppose you're right. There's a spare room, yes, but… Clara hesitated, then forged ahead. It's very small, more of a storage closet, really. My father used it for his papers and winter clothes. I don't need much space. I know, but… Clara bit her lip, then made a decision that surprised even herself. The bed is large enough for two people, if you don't mind sharing. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Ronan's green eyes widened slightly. Clara, I don't want you to feel pressured. This marriage doesn't have to be, that is, I don't expect. I know you don't. Clara's voice was steady despite the way her heart was racing. But we're going to be living together for however long this lasts. We need to learn to trust each other completely. Besides, she added with a smile that was only slightly forced, it's a big bed and I'm told I don't snore. Ronan stared at her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of her offer. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, if you're sure, I'm sure. Later that night, as Clara lay rigid on one side of her father's old bed, while Ronan maintained careful distance on the other side, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The man beside her was still virtually a stranger despite everything they had shared. She could hear his breathing in the darkness, feel the warmth radiating from his body, sense his careful alertness even in apparent sleep. What had she been thinking, inviting him into her most private space? What if he misunderstood her motives? What if she had misunderstood her own motives? But as the hours passed and nothing more dramatic occurred than the occasional shift of position or quiet sigh, Clara found herself relaxing. There was something oddly comforting about not being alone in the dark, about knowing that if danger came in the night, she would not have to face it by herself. Just before dawn, she was awakened by the sound of movement. Ronan was sitting on the edge of the bed, silhouetted against the gray light filtering through the window, reaching for his boots. Going somewhere, she whispered, checking the perimeter. Old habits. Clara watched him move through the familiar routine of dressing and arming himself, noting the unconscious efficiency of his movements. This was a man accustomed to danger, to sleeping light and waking ready. "Ronan." He paused at the bedroom door. "Yes, thank you for everything." She couldn't see his expression in the dim light, but his voice was warm when he answered, "Thank you for trusting me." After he left, Clara lay in bed watching the sunrise paint the walls of her small cabin in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere outside, her new husband was making his careful circuit of their defenses, checking for signs of trouble, preparing for another day of their strange partnership. In 3 days, she had gone from lonely spinster to married woman. In 3 days, her entire world had been turned upside down by a man who had appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. It should have terrified her. Instead, as she listened to Ronan's quiet footsteps returning to the cabin, Clara found herself smiling. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she was looking forward to the day ahead. The morning brought new challenges in the form of Martha Henderson, the closest thing their scattered community had to an official gossip. She arrived just after breakfast, her buggy rattling into the yard with purposeful determination. "Clara, dear," Martha called out, her voice carrying the false sweetness of someone fishing for scandal. "I heard the most interesting news yesterday." Clara and Ronan exchanged glances. They had been expecting this visit. In fact, they had been preparing for it. "Martha," Clara replied evenly, "how nice to see you." Martha's sharp eyes took in every detail of the scene before her. Ronan working on the corral fence, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his movements casual and familiar. Clara standing in the doorway of her cabin like a woman comfortable in her domestic role, the general air of settled domesticity that they had been carefully cultivating. "I understand congratulations are in order," Martha said, her tone suggesting anything but congratulation. "Thank you," Clara replied. "I suppose the news is spreading quickly." "Oh, my dear, you know how people talk. A mysterious marriage, a stranger appearing just when you needed help." Martha's smile was razor sharp. "Some folks might find the timing suspicious." "Some folks," Ronan said mildly, approaching the buggy with his hat in his hands and the perfect picture of polite deference, might consider it romantic. Martha Henderson turned her attention to Clara's new husband with obvious interest. Up close, Clara noted with a mixture of pride and possessiveness, Ronan was undeniably handsome. The combination of Irish and Apache heritage had given him striking features that no woman could ignore. The strong jaw and high cheekbones of his mother's people, the green eyes and easy smile of his father's. "Mr. Blackhawk, isn't it?" Martha simpered. "Such an unusual name." "Family name," Ronan replied simply. "And where exactly are you from, Mr. Blackhawk?" Clara watched the exchange with growing irritation. Martha Henderson's idea of neighborly conversation was really just socially acceptable interrogation. "Here and there," Ronan answered with infuriating politeness. "A man goes where the work takes him. And what sort of work is that?" "Whatever needs doing, ma'am." Clara had to admire his technique. Every answer was perfectly courteous and completely uninformative. Martha was clearly frustrated by her inability to extract useful gossip. "Well," Martha said finally, "I'm sure we'll all be very interested to get to know you better, Mr. Blackhawk. Perhaps you and Clara will join us for Sunday services this week." The invitation was clearly a trap. Refusing would fuel gossip about their marriage being false or shameful. Accepting would put them on public display for the entire community to examine and judge. "That sounds lovely," Clara said before Ronan could respond. "We'll be there." Martha's smile was triumphant. "Wonderful. I'm sure Reverend Thompson will be delighted to meet Clara's new husband." After Martha had driven away, trailing dust and malicious satisfaction, Clara and Ronan looked at each other with mutual understanding. "Sunday services," Ronan said thoughtfully. "Sunday services," Clara agreed. "Any idea what we're walking into?" Clara's smile was grim. A firing squad with hymns. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharper, more vivid. Clara stood before her small mirror, trying to tame her auburn hair into something respectable for church. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, not from nerves about appearing in public with her new husband, but from the memory of how those same hands had felt when Ronan had helped her braid her hair the night before. It had been such a simple gesture. She had mentioned struggling with the elaborate style her mother had taught her, and he had quietly offered to help. His fingers had moved through her hair with surprising gentleness, working the strands into an intricate pattern that spoke of experience with Apache women's traditional styles. The intimacy of it, the quiet concentration on his face as he worked, had made her breath catch in her throat. Almost ready. Ronan's voice came from the main room, carefully pitched to give her privacy while letting her know he was waiting. "Just a moment," she called back, securing the last pin and smoothing her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes and had been her mother's before her. When she emerged from the bedroom, Ronan was standing by the window looking out at the prairie with the alert posture that was becoming familiar. He had cleaned up remarkably well for someone who claimed to own only what he could carry on horseback. His dark hair was neatly tied back, his shirt was clean and pressed, and he wore a black vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He looked, Clara realized, with a flutter of pride, like exactly the kind of man any woman would be proud to call husband. "You look beautiful," he said simply when he turned to see her, and the sincerity in his voice made her cheeks warm. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." They walked to the barn together to hitch up Clara's small wagon, their movements coordinated with the kind of easy partnership that usually took years to develop. As Ronan helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand lingering on hers for just a moment longer than necessary, Clara found herself wondering when their careful charade had begun to feel so natural. The ride to the makeshift church, really just the schoolhouse with benches arranged for Sunday service, took nearly an hour across rolling prairie. They talked quietly as they traveled, discussing practical matters like the approaching winter and the need to take sheep to market, but Clara was acutely aware of the larger conversation they weren't having. The conversation about what would happen when their arrangement was no longer necessary, when the immediate danger had passed, and they were left to decide whether their marriage of convenience might become something more. "Clara," Ronan said as the small cluster of buildings that marked the settlement came into view, "there's something I need you to know before we go in there." The serious tone of his voice made her stomach clench with anxiety. "What is it?" If anyone asked direct questions about my military service, about my time with the cavalry, I won't lie, I can't. But I also won't volunteer information that might put you in an awkward position. Clara studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "What exactly are you worried about? David Morrison wasn't just my commanding officer. He was a friend, a good man who treated his scouts with respect and tried to minimize civilian casualties whenever possible." Ronan's hands tightened on the reins. "When he died at Little Bighorn, I was supposed to be with him. I was tracking Lakota movements 50 miles away when the attack came." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Clara felt her heart contract with sympathy. "You blame yourself. I was his best scout. If I had been there, I might have seen signs of the ambush, might have warned him in time." Ronan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Instead, he died because I was chasing ghosts in the wrong place." Clara reached over and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You can't know that. You can't blame yourself for being where you were ordered to be." "Can't I?" Ronan's smile was bitter. "Jim Morrison lost his brother because of decisions I made, Clara. When he figures out who I am, and he will, how do you think he's going to react to discovering his neighbor is married to the man who failed to save David's life?" The complexity of the situation hit Clara like a physical blow. Her new husband wasn't just caught between two worlds racially. He was trapped between conflicting loyalties, carrying guilt over deaths He couldn't have prevented facing condemnation from every direction. "We'll face that when it happens," she said firmly. "Together." Ronan looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You never cease to amaze me, Clara Hayes." "Clara Blackhawk," she corrected gently, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed his entire face. The schoolhouse was already full when they arrived, with nearly 30 people crowded onto rough benches facing a simple wooden cross. Clara could feel eyes turning toward them. As they found seats near the back, could hear the whispered conversations that followed their entrance. She kept her chin up and her expression serene, playing the role of happy newlywed with determination born of pure stubbornness. Reverend Thompson was a thin, earnest man in his 50s who traveled a circuit that covered nearly 200 square miles of frontier territory. He had known Clara since childhood and had performed the burial service for her father. When he spotted her sitting beside a stranger, his eyebrows rose in obvious surprise. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "Before we begin our worship this morning, I understand we have cause for celebration. Sister Clara Hayes has taken a husband." The announcement sent a ripple of whispered conversation through the congregation. Clara felt Ronan tense beside her, but she reached over and took his hand, intertwining their fingers in full view of everyone present. "Clara, would you and your husband care to introduce yourselves to the congregation?" It wasn't really a request, and they both knew it. Clara stood with as much grace as she could manage, drawing Ronan up beside her. "Thank you, Reverend Thompson. I'd like you all to meet my husband, Ronan Blackhawk. We were married this past week." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, examining every detail of her new husband's appearance, noting the darkness of his skin, the high cheekbones that spoke of Indian heritage, the way he carried himself with unconscious dignity, despite the obvious hostility of some members of the congregation. "Welcome, Brother Blackhawk," Reverend Thompson said with careful courtesy. "We're always pleased to welcome new members to our community." "Thank you, Reverend," Ronan replied, his voice steady, despite the tension Clara could feel radiating from him. "I'm honored to be here." They sat down amid a buzz of whispered conversations, and Clara knew that every word, every gesture, every glance between them would be dissected and analyzed by the community gossips. She had expected this, had prepared for it, but the reality of being on display was more intense than she had imagined. The service proceeded with hymns and prayers, but Clara found it difficult to concentrate on Reverend Thompson's sermon about love and forgiveness when she could feel the undercurrents of suspicion and disapproval flowing around them like a cold river. Beside her, Ronan sat with perfect composure, his face revealing nothing of whatever thoughts occupied his mind. It was during the final hymn that disaster struck. Clara was singing Amazing Grace in her clear soprano when she became aware of a commotion near the front of the church. A man she didn't recognize, rough-dressed and hard-faced, had pushed through the door and was scanning the congregation with obvious purpose. "Sorry to interrupt, folks," the stranger called out, his voice cutting through the music like a knife. "But I'm looking for a man. Apache breed about 6 feet tall, goes by the name Blackhawk." The hymn died away into stunned silence. Clara felt Ronan go perfectly still beside her, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the gun he wore concealed beneath his coat. "I'm Blackhawk," Ronan said calmly, rising to his feet. "What do you want?" The stranger's weathered face split into a predatory grin. "Name's Tom Crawford, deputy sheriff out of Cheyenne. I got a warrant here for your arrest." The words hit the congregation like a thunderclap. Women gasped, men reached for weapons that weren't there, and children began to cry in the sudden chaos. Clara felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. "What are the charges?" Ronan asked, his voice betraying nothing of whatever emotions he might be feeling. "Murder," Crawford replied with obvious satisfaction. "Murder of 5 cavalry troopers near Fort Laramie last month. Witness says you and a band of Apache warriors ambushed a patrol." Clara's blood turned to ice. Murder. The word seemed to echo in the small space like a death knell. Around them she could see neighbors who had been merely suspicious before now looking at Ronan with open fear and hostility. "I was nowhere near Fort Laramie last month," Ronan said evenly. "Your witness is mistaken." "That's for a judge to decide," Crawford sneered. "Now you can come quiet-like, or I can make this hard on everyone. Your choice." Clara's mind raced frantically. This was obviously a setup. The timing was too convenient, the accusations too perfectly designed to destroy Ronan's credibility and their marriage. But who was behind it? The Mullins gang, someone else with a grudge against mixed-blood scouts. "Deputy Crawford," she said, standing and moving to Ronan's side. "I can vouch for my husband's whereabouts last month. He was here with me." Crawford's grin widened. "That's so, and when exactly did you two get married, Mrs. Blackhawk, is it?" The trap was perfectly set. If she admitted they had only been married for a week, she couldn't provide an alibi for the previous month. If she lied about the date of their marriage, she would be committing perjury and risking her own arrest. "That's enough." Jim Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stood up from his seat near the front, his weathered face hard with anger. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Crawford, but I won't have you disrupting Sunday service with false accusations." "False accusations?" Crawford laughed harshly. "I got a sworn statement right here from a cavalry sergeant who saw the whole thing." "Let me see that warrant," Morrison demanded, striding forward with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Crawford handed over the official-looking document with obvious reluctance. Morrison examined it carefully, his expression growing darker by the moment. "This warrant is dated 3 days ago," he said finally. "Funny thing is, Blackhawk here has been in our community for over a week. Lot of witnesses to that." "So he was here when the murders happened?" Crawford's confidence wavered slightly. "The murders you're talking about happened 6 weeks ago, not last month," Morrison continued remorselessly. "I know because I got a letter from the Army asking if anyone in our area had seen unusual Apache activity around that time." He fixed Crawford with a stare that could have melted steel, which makes me wonder why a deputy sheriff would have his dates so confused. The crowd was beginning to murmur with growing hostility. Crawford's hand moved toward his gun, and Clara saw Ronan tense in response. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong move away from violence in the middle of Sunday service. That was when Pete Morrison chose to speak up. "Hold on just a minute," Pete said, standing up with obvious reluctance. "Jim, I think there's something you need to know about our new neighbor here." Clara felt her heart sink. Pete had recognized something, had put together pieces of Ronan's identity that would destroy any chance of community support. "What are you talking about, Pete?" Jim asked impatiently. "Ronan Blackhawk," Pete said slowly, as if testing the name. "I knew that sounded familiar. There was a scout by that name served under Colonel David Morrison during the Indian Wars. Apache breed, just like this one." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as the implications of Pete's revelation sank in. Jim Morrison's face had gone white as paper. "David's scout," Jim whispered. "You're David's scout." Ronan straightened to his full height, meeting Jim Morrison's stare directly. "I had the honor of serving under Colonel Morrison, yes. He was a good man and a fine officer. You were supposed to be with him," Jim said, his voice growing stronger and more dangerous with each word. "At Little Bighorn, you were supposed to be scouting ahead of his position. I was following orders to track Lakota movements 50 miles south of the battle site," Ronan replied steadily. "By the time I realized what was happening and got back, it was too late." Jim Morrison's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The pain in his eyes was terrible to see. The raw grief of a man reliving his brother's death, looking for someone to blame. "Too late," he repeated. My brother died because his scout wasn't where he was supposed to be. Your brother died because he was a brave man who refused to retreat when he should have, Ronan said quietly. He died trying to protect his men just like the soldier he was. Don't you dare, Jim's voice cracked like a whip. Don't you dare tell me how my brother died when you weren't even there to see it. The confrontation was spiraling out of control. Crawford was grinning with malicious satisfaction, clearly delighted to see the community turning against Ronan. Other members of the congregation were beginning to mutter among themselves, old prejudices and suspicions rising to the surface. Clara knew she had to act. In another moment, the situation would explode into violence that could destroy everything they had tried to build. "Stop it," she said, her clear voice cutting through the angry voices like a bell. "All of you just stop." She moved to stand directly in front of Ronan, facing down the entire congregation with a courage that surprised even herself. "You want to know the truth about my husband? I'll tell you the truth. Yes, he's half-Apache. Yes, he served as a cavalry scout. Yes, he was following orders when Colonel Morrison died. But here's what Deputy Crawford and the rest of you don't seem to understand. This man risked his life to save mine. This man has spent the past week working from dawn to dusk to improve my property and prepare for winter. This man has treated me with more respect and kindness than most so-called civilized folks have ever shown." Her voice was rising with passion, and she could see some of the hostility in the congregation beginning to waver. "You want to arrest him for murders he didn't commit. You want to blame him for failing to prevent a tragedy no one could have foreseen. Fine, but you'll have to go through me first." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Clara stood with her chin raised and her shoulders back, every inch the frontier woman who had learned to fight for what she believed in. It was Doc Henley who broke the tense silence. "The girl's right," he said, simply rising to his feet with the slow dignity of age. "I've known Clara Hayes since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, and she's never been wrong about people. If she says this man is good, then he's good enough for me." "And me," said Mary Cooper, the schoolteacher, standing up with quiet determination. "And me," added Frank Peters, whose barn had been burned by the real Mullins gang. One by one, members of the congregation began to stand in support of Clara and Ronan. Not all of them. Jim Morrison remained seated, his face twisted with grief and anger, and Pete Morrison looked disgusted by what he clearly saw as misguided sentiment. But enough stood that Crawford began to look nervous. "This is all very touching," the false deputy sneered, "but I still got a warrant to serve." "No," Jim Morrison said, suddenly his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You don't." Everyone turned to stare at him in surprise. Jim held up the warrant Crawford had shown him, his expression grim. "This warrant is a fake," he announced. "Bad paper, wrong official seal, and signed by a judge who's been dead for 2 years. I should know. I've seen enough real warrants in my time." Crawford's face went white. His hand moved toward his gun, but found himself facing a dozen armed men who had been watching the proceedings with growing suspicion. "Easy there, friend," Doc Henley said mildly. "Seems to me you got some explaining to do." "Who sent you?" Ronan asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Who paid you to come after me with false charges?" Crawford's eyes darted around the hostile faces surrounding him, looking for an escape route. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Jake Mullins," Clara said suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. "Jake Mullins sent you. This is his revenge for what happened at my ranch." The confirmation was written all over Crawford's face. The false deputy realized his position was hopeless and made a desperate play for his weapon. He never cleared leather. Ronan's hand moved with the speed of a striking snake, his own pistol appearing in his grip as if by magic. The sound of the hammer being cocked back echoed through the small church like thunder. "I wouldn't," Ronan said conversationally. Crawford froze with his gun half-drawn, sweat beading on his forehead. Around them, the congregation watched in fascinated silence as the drama played out. "Now then," Ronan continued, his voice perfectly calm. "You're going to tell us exactly who hired you, how much they paid you, and where we can find them. And you're going to do it right now, before I decide that a fake deputy trying to arrest an innocent man on false charges might just be resisting arrest himself." The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that no one in the room doubted Ronan's willingness to carry it out. Crawford's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Jake Mullins," he said finally. "Jake Mullins paid me $50 to come arrest you on murder charges. Said once you were in custody, you'd have an accident on the way to trial." A collective gasp went up from the congregation. Even those who had been suspicious of Ronan were horrified by the implications of what Crawford was describing. "Where is Jake now?" Clara asked. I don't know. He said he'd be in touch after I brought you in." Jim Morrison stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by grudging respect. "Ronan, I owe you an apology, and my thanks. Seems like you've been protecting our community from men we didn't even know were threatening it." Ronan holstered his weapon with the same fluid grace he had drawn it. "Your brother was a good man, Jim. I failed him once. I won't fail his memory by letting scum like this destroy what he died to protect." The simple statement, delivered without drama or self-pity, seemed to diffuse the last of the tension in the room. Jim Morrison extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ronan shook it. "Welcome to the community, brother," Jim said simply. The crisis was over, but Clara knew their troubles were far from finished. Jake Mullins was still out there, still planning revenge, still dangerous, but for the first time since this all began, they weren't facing the threat alone. They had allies, now neighbors, who were willing to stand with them against whatever came next. As the congregation began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over the morning's dramatic events, Reverend Thompson approached Clara and Ronan with obvious concern. "I've been ministering on the frontier for 20 years, he said quietly, "and I've learned to recognize the signs when real trouble is coming. You two need to be very careful. Men like Jake Mullins don't give up easily." "We know," Clara replied, "but we won't be driven off our land by outlaws and murderers." "I wasn't suggesting you should be," Thompson said with a slight smile. "I was going to offer the help of the church. We may be scattered thin out here, but we take care of our own." The offer of community support should have been reassuring. Instead, Clara felt a chill of premonition. The events of the morning had exposed their marriage to public scrutiny, had revealed dangerous secrets about Ronan's past, and had made it clear that Jake Mullins was planning something far worse than simple revenge. As they rode home in their small wagon, the autumn sun warm on their faces, and the prairie stretching endlessly around them, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding toward a confrontation that would test everything they had built together. "Ronan," she said, as their cabin came into view, "what do you think Mullins is really planning?" "Nothing good," he replied grimly, "but whatever it is, we'll face it together." The simple promise, spoken with quiet conviction, steadied Clara's nerves. Whatever came next, they would indeed face it together. The Shepherdess and the Apache, bound by necessity and growing into something that felt increasingly like love. That night, as they lay in their shared bed listening to the wind across the prairie, Clara found herself thinking about the moment in church when Ronan had drawn his gun to protect them both. The speed and precision of his movement, the calm authority in his voice, the way he had taken control of a dangerous situation without hesitation, of it spoke to the kind of man he truly was, beneath the careful politeness and painful uncertainty. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, as Ronan's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep beside her, Clara found herself smiling in the darkness. Let Jake Mullins come. Let the whole world come if it wanted. She had found something worth fighting for, and she wasn't giving it up without a battle. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon for days finally broke 3 nights after the confrontation at church. Clara woke to the sound of thunder so fierce it seemed to shake the very foundations of their small cabin. Lightning split the darkness outside their bedroom window, illuminating the prairie in stark silver flashes that made the familiar landscape look alien and threatening. "Ronan," she whispered, reaching across the bed, but her hand found only empty space and cold sheets. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering with sudden alarm. Through the storm's chaos, she could hear voices outside, men's voices, angry and purposeful. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the tone, if not the words. This wasn't the random violence of nature. This was planned, deliberate, human, moving with the careful quiet her father had taught her during childhood, games of hide and seek that had actually been lessons in survival. Clara slipped from the bed and crept to the window. What she saw in the lightning-illuminated yard below made her stomach clench with terror. 8 men on horseback surrounded their cabin, their faces hidden by rain-soaked bandanas, but their intent unmistakable. At their head sat a figure she recognized even in the storm's chaos. Jake Mullins, his scarred face twisted with malevolent satisfaction. He was shouting something at the house, his words lost in the thunder, but his meaning clear enough. Where was Ronan? Clara's hand shook as she reached for the rifle she now kept beside the bed. Her father's Springfield felt heavier than usual, the metal cold against her palms, as she checked the load with movements made clumsy by fear. 6 shots, 8 men. The mathematics of survival were not in her favor. Clara Hayes. Jake's voice cut through the storm like a blade audible now during a brief lull in the thunder. "We know you're in there. Send out that half-breed husband of yours, and maybe we'll let you live." Clara's jaw tightened with anger that burned through her fear. She moved to the window and threw it open, rain immediately soaking her nightgown and hair. "Go to hell, Jake Mullins," she shouted back. "You're not welcome on my land." Jake's laughter was ugly, full of promised violence. "Your land, honey. Once we're done here tonight, this land won't belong to nobody but the buzzards." "Where's my husband?" Clara demanded, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Your precious Apache is indisposed at the moment," Jake sneered. "Don't worry, you'll be joining him real soon." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. They had taken Ronan. Somehow, despite all his precautions and warrior's instincts, they had taken him, which meant she was alone facing 8 armed men with nothing but a 6-shot rifle and whatever courage she could scrape together from the depths of her terror. "Here's the deal, little shepherdess," Jake continued, his voice carrying clearly now that the storm was beginning to move past. "You come out with your hands up and we'll make it quick. You make us come in after you and we'll take our time. Your choice." Clara's mind raced frantically. The cabin was defensible, but not against 8 men for any length of time. The barn was too far away to reach safely. Her nearest neighbors were miles distant, and even if they heard gunfire over the retreating storm, help would arrive too late to matter. But she would not surrender. Not to these animals, not after everything she and Ronan had built together. If she was going to die tonight, she would die fighting. "I've got a better deal for you, Jake," she called out, buying time while she tried to think of a plan. "You ride away now, and I won't put a bullet between your eyes." More laughter from the men below. They were spreading out now, positioning themselves to cover all approaches to the cabin. Professional killers who had done this before, who knew how to corner prey and eliminate escape routes. "You always were a mouthy little thing," Jake replied. "Can't wait to teach you some manners." Clara pulled back from the window as a rifle shot exploded in the night, the bullet splintering wood inches from her head. So much for negotiation. She scrambled across the floor to the bedroom door, her bare feet silent on the rough wooden planks. The main room of the cabin was dark as a tomb filled with familiar shapes that now seemed menacing in the storm-filtered moonlight. Clara made her way to the kitchen window that faced the barn, hoping against hope that she might catch sight of Ronan, might find some sign that he was still alive. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. A dark figure was moving through the shadows near the corral, keeping low and moving with the fluid grace she had come to recognize as uniquely Ronan's. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly sobbed aloud. He was alive, he was free, and if she knew her husband at all, he was planning something that would even the odds considerably. Another rifle shot shattered the kitchen window above her head, showering her with glass. The men outside were getting impatient, beginning their assault in earnest. Clara rolled away from the window and took position behind her father's heavy oak table, using it as cover while she tried to spot targets in the chaos outside. "Time's up, Shepherdess." Jake's voice was closer now, probably near the front door. "Last chance to come out peaceful." Clara's answer was a rifle shot that took Jake's hat clean off his head and sent him diving for cover behind a water trough. The Springfield's report echoed like thunder in the confined space of the cabin, and she was already working the bolt to chamber another round when the night erupted in gunfire. Bullets shattered windows, splintered door frames, and chewed chunks of wood from the cabin's log walls. Clara kept her head down and tried to identify individual shooters, looking for clean shots through the chaos. These weren't the panicked volleys of amateurs. This was disciplined, coordinated fire designed to pin her down, while other men moved into position. Through the noise of the assault, Clara heard something that made her heart race with hope. The distinctive crack of Ronan's Winchester firing from somewhere near the barn. Then another shot and another, each one precisely placed and followed by a scream of pain from one of their attackers. "He's behind us," someone shouted. "The Apache's behind us." Jake's voice cut through the confusion like a whip. "Tom, Billy, swing around and flush him out. The rest of you keep the girl pinned down." Clara used the momentary lull in fire directed at the cabin to rise up and squeeze off another shot. This one took a bandit in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him toppling from his horse. 4 men still mounted, 3 on foot, and Ronan somewhere in the darkness picking them off one by one. The odds were still terrible, but they were no longer impossible. Glass exploded inward as someone threw a burning brand through the front window, the flames immediately catching on her mother's curtains. Clara cursed and scrambled to stamp out the fire before it could spread, but even as she fought the flames, she realized the true purpose of the arson. They weren't trying to burn her out. They were creating light, illuminating the interior of the cabin to make her an easier target. "There she is." Jake's voice was triumphant. "Right there by the window." Clara threw herself sideways as 3 rifles spoke simultaneously, their bullets chewing through the space she had occupied a heartbeat before. She hit the floor hard, her Springfield sliding away across the rough planks, and for a moment she lay stunned and helpless. That was when the front door exploded inward. Jake Mullins stood framed in the doorway like a vision from hell, his clothes torn and bloody, his scarred face twisted with rage and malicious satisfaction. Behind him, 2 more men pushed into the cabin with guns drawn and ready. "Well, well, well," Jake panted, his eyes gleaming with firelight and madness. "The famous Clara Hayes all alone and out of tricks." Clara's hand inched toward the pistol on her father's gun belt, hanging from a chair just within reach. If she could just— "Don't even think about it!" Jake snarled, swinging his rifle to cover her. "Billy, get that gun away from her." One of Jake's men moved forward with obvious reluctance. He was young, Clara realized, probably no older than 20, with the kind of face that might have been pleasant under different circumstances. "Jake," Billy said uncertainly, "maybe we should just take what we came for and get out. That Apache is still out there, and he's already dropped 3 of our boys." "What we came for is right here," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off Clara. "This little bitch and her half-breed husband have caused me nothing but trouble. Time to settle accounts." "The Apache ain't going to just let us kill his woman," the 3rd man said nervously. "He'll hunt us to the ends of the earth." "Not if he's dead, too." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his already ugly face into something truly monstrous, which he will be soon as Tom and the others finish with him. As if summoned by his words, gunfire erupted from somewhere near the barn. the rapid, distinctive reports of Winchester rifles firing as fast as their actions could be worked. But instead of the disciplined volleys Clara had been hearing, this was desperate, panicked shooting, the kind of noise men made when they were fighting for their lives against a superior opponent. Jake's confidence wavered slightly. What the hell is going on out there? His question was answered by a blood-curdling war cry that echoed across the prairie like something from the old stories, followed by the thunder of hooves and more gunfire. Clara's heart leaped with fierce pride and desperate hope. Ronan wasn't just alive, he was winning. "Boss," Billy said urgently, "we need to get out of here, now." "Like hell." Jake's attention snapped back to Clara with renewed fury. "I've come too far and lost too many men to leave empty-handed. If I can't have my revenge on the Apache, I'll settle for his woman." He raised his rifle, and Clara knew with crystal clarity that she was about to die. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching like honey. She could see Jake's finger tighten on the trigger, could see the muzzle of his weapon swing toward her heart, could hear her own rapid breathing loud as thunder in her ears. Then the back door of the cabin exploded inward in a shower of splinters and glass. Ronan Blackhawk entered their small home like a force of nature, his Winchester in his hands, and war paint streaking his face in patterns that spoke of ancient rage and modern precision. His green eyes burned with a cold fire that promised death to anyone who threatened what he had claimed as his own. The Apache war cry that tore from his throat froze Jake Mullins in place for the crucial half-second that meant the difference between life and death. Ronan's first shot took the third gunman's center mass, dropping him instantly. His second shot shattered Jake's rifle stock before the outlaw could bring it to bear. Billy, showing more sense than loyalty, threw down his weapon and raised his hands. "Don't shoot, I surrender." But Jake Mullins, faced with the ruin of all his plans and the prospect of dying in a stranger's cabin, chose to go down fighting. He clawed for the pistol at his hip, his face twisted with desperate rage. Ronan's third shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into Clara's kitchen table. The outlaw leader hit the floor hard, but immediately began scrambling for his dropped weapon, blood streaming from his wound, but his determination unshaken. "Jake, no!" Clara screamed, but she wasn't trying to save the man who had come to murder her. She was trying to save her husband from having to live with cold-blooded killing. Ronan heard her voice and hesitated for just a moment. His rifle trained on Jake's crawling form. That moment of mercy nearly cost him everything. Jake's hand closed around his pistol, and he rolled onto his back with the weapon coming up fast. His shot went wide, but only because Clara threw herself sideways into his line of fire, knocking his aim off target. The bullet meant for Ronan's heart burned across Clara's ribs, instead tearing through her nightgown and leaving a trail of fire along her side. She cried out in pain and shock, but even as she fell, she was reaching for her father's pistol. What happened next would be debated in frontier saloons for years to come. Some said Ronan's final shot was the fastest draw anyone had ever seen. Others claimed it was impossible for a man to fire that accurately while diving sideways to shield his wounded wife. A few swore they saw the spirit of an Apache warrior standing behind Ronan, guiding his aim with ghostly hands. All anyone knew for certain was that Jake Mullins' last sight in this world was the muzzle flash of a Winchester rifle, and his last thought was probably surprise that a half-breed had outfought him in the end. The silence that followed the final gunshot was deafening. Clara lay on the cabin floor, clutching her bleeding side and staring at Jake's motionless form. Ronan knelt beside her, his hands gentle, despite the violence they had just dealt out, checking her wound with the practiced efficiency of a man who had tended battlefield injuries before. "How bad?" she whispered, afraid to look. "Burned across the ribs, but it didn't go deep," Ronan replied, his voice steady despite the concern in his eyes. "You'll have a scar, but you'll live. What about the others? Dead or scattered?" Ronan's attention turned to Billy, who was still standing with his hands raised and his face white with terror. "You, what's your name?" Billy Crane, sir. I didn't want to be part of this. Jake made me come. How old are you, Billy? 19, sir. Ronan studied the young man for a long moment, weighing options. Clara could see the internal struggle on her husband's face. The warrior who had learned that mercy was often weakness, warring with the man who remembered what it was like to be young and stupid and caught up in other people's violence. You have family, Billy? Yes, sir, Ma and 2 little sisters down in Texas. Go to them, Ronan said finally. Tonight. Ride hard and don't stop until you're across the state line. If I ever see you again, if I ever hear of you riding with outlaws again, I'll kill you without a second thought. Are we clear? Yes, sir. Crystal clear. Thank you, sir. Billy backed toward the ruined front door, then turned and ran for his horse as if all the demons of hell were chasing him. Within moments, the sound of rapidly departing hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the crackling of dying flames and the whistle of wind through bullet holes. Clara let Ronan help her to the bed, biting back groans of pain as he cleaned and bandaged her wound with supplies from her father's medical kit. His hands were steady and gentle, but she could see the rage still burning in his eyes, not directed at her, but at the situation, at his failure to protect her, completely at the violence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. It's not your fault, she said quietly, reading his thoughts. Isn't it? Ronan's voice was bitter. I let them get close enough to hurt you. I failed again. You saved my life. Again. After letting it be endangered in the first place. Clara reached out and grasped his chin, forcing him to meet her eyes. Listen to me, Ronan Blackhawk. I'm alive because of you. This home is still standing because of you. Those men came here to commit murder, and they're dead or gone because you fought for us. Don't you dare turn this into another reason to blame yourself. The fierce conviction in her voice seemed to penetrate the wall of self-recrimination Ronan was building around himself. Some of the tension went out of his shoulders, though the guilt remained in his eyes. How do you do it? He asked quietly. Do what? See the best in everything. Find hope in the middle of disaster. Believe in people even when they let you down. Clara considered the question seriously. I suppose it's because the alternative is giving up, and I've never been very good at that. Despite everything, the violence, the blood, the ruined cabin around them, Ronan smiled. No, you're not, are you? They spent the rest of the night cleaning up the damage and preparing for whatever might come next. The cabin was scarred but still livable, though it would need extensive repairs. More importantly, Jake Mullins was dead and his gang was scattered, which meant the immediate threat to their safety was ended. As dawn broke gray and cold over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pewter and rose, Clara and Ronan stood in their doorway looking out at the evidence of the night's battle. Bodies would need to be buried, damage would need to be repaired, and explanations would have to be given to neighbors who had undoubtedly heard the gunfire. But they were alive and they were together, and that was enough for now. Clara, Ronan said as they watched the sun climb higher, there's something I need to tell you. The serious tone of his voice made her stomach clench with worry. What is it? Last night, when I thought they might kill you, when I realized I might lose you. He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man raised to keep his emotions carefully guarded. I realized that this marriage, this partnership we started as strangers, has become something more, at least for me. Clara's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. What are you saying? Ronan turned to face her fully, his green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I'm saying I love you, Clara Blackhawk, not because of some biblical law or practical arrangement, but because you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. I'm saying that if you'll have me, really have me, not just as protection or convenience, but as a true husband, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of you. The words hit Clara with the force of a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they were so perfectly what she had been hoping to hear without daring to hope. Tears sprang to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Oh, Ronan," she whispered, reaching out to cup his face in her hands. "I've been in love with you since that first day when you agreed to honor my father's strange law without question or mockery. I've been waiting for you to see that what we have is real, not just convenient." The kiss that followed was different from the polite pecks they had exchanged for the benefit of neighbors and church congregations. This was the kiss of two people who had found each other against all odds, who had fought for their right to be together, who were choosing each other freely and completely. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara rested her forehead against Ronan's and smiled through her tears. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we rebuild," Ronan said simply. "We fix what was broken, we strengthen what survived, and we make this place into a real home for a real marriage. Together, together." As the morning sun climbed higher over the Wyoming territory, Clara and Ronan Blackhawk began the work of building their life together in earnest. The Shepherdess and the Apache no longer strangers, bound by necessity but husband and wife, joined by love and tested by fire. The worst was over, or so they thought. It was 3 days later, as they were replacing the shattered windows and repairing bullet holes in the cabin walls, that Jim Morrison rode into their yard with news that would test their newfound happiness one final time. "Ronan!" he called out, dismounting with the stiff movements of a man who had ridden hard and fast. "Clara, we need to talk." The grim expression on Jim's weathered face sent a chill down Clara's spine. "What's wrong?" "Territorial judge is coming through next week," Jim said without preamble. "Judge Harrison out of Cheyenne. He's heard about the shooting, wants to investigate." "Investigate what?" Ronan asked, though Clara could see from his expression that he already knew. "The killing of 8 men by a half-breed Apache," Jim replied bluntly. "There's folks saying it was murder, not self-defense, saying you used the attack on Clara as an excuse to settle old scores with white men." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That's ridiculous. They came here to kill us. Ronan was protecting his home, his wife." "I know that, and you know that," Jim said. "But Judge Harrison's got a reputation for being hard on Indians. Real hard. Word is he's already made up his mind that Ronan's guilty of something, just needs to figure out what." The implications hit Clara like a landslide. After everything they had been through, after finally finding love and happiness together, they were going to lose it all to legal prejudice and frontier justice. "What are our options?" Ronan asked calmly, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Jim's expression was grim. "Run, fight, or stand trial. And I'll tell you straight, if you stand trial in front of Harrison, you're going to hang." Clara's world tilted on its axis. Run away from the home they had built together, fight the law itself, or watch the man she loved die on a gallows for the crime of protecting what was his. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Maybe there is," Jim said slowly. "But you're not going to like it." Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Tell us." Jim Morrison removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through graying hair, the gesture of a man buying time before delivering unwelcome news. "There's a territorial marshal named Samuel Cross, operates out of Denver. He's got a reputation for being fair to Indians, for actually caring about justice instead of just politics." He paused, meeting Ronan's steady gaze. "He's also got the authority to overrule Judge Harrison's jurisdiction if he can be convinced there are extenuating circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Ronan asked, though Clara could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Federal circumstances. If this case involves federal law instead of territorial law, Cross can claim jurisdiction." Jim's expression was troubled. "The thing is, that would mean proving Jake Mullins and his gang were involved in crimes that cross state lines. Mail robbery, attacks on federal property, that sort of thing." Clara felt her heart sink. "But we don't have any proof of that." "Actually, we might," Jim said slowly. Doc Henley found something interesting when he was helping bury the bodies. Jake Mullins had federal mail in his saddlebags, letters addressed to folks in Colorado and Nebraska, some of them torn open and robbed. A glimmer of hope sparked in Clara's chest. That's federal mail robbery, a hanging offense. It is, Jim agreed. But here's the problem. To use that evidence, you'd have to surrender yourselves to Marshall Cross in Denver. You'd be gambling that he's as fair as his reputation suggests, and that he can build a strong enough case to convince a federal court that Ronan acted in defense of his home and family. The weight of the decision settled on Clara's shoulders like a lead blanket. Surrender themselves to federal marshals and hope for justice, or become fugitives from a territorial court that had already decided Ronan's guilt. Either way, their quiet life as husband and wife was over. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked. "Judge Harrison arrives Monday. That gives you 4 days." Jim replaced his hat and gathered his reins. "Whatever you decide, Clara, you know you've got friends in this community. We won't forget what Ronan did to protect all of us from the Mullins gang." After Jim rode away, Clara and Ronan stood in their yard, watching the dust settle, both lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, but Clara felt cold down to her bones. "What do you think?" she asked finally. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes scanning the horizon with the automatic alertness of a man accustomed to danger. "I think Jim Morrison is a good man who's trying to help. I also think Marshall Cross might be our only chance." "You want to surrender." "I want to fight," Ronan said fiercely, "but not in a rigged court with a prejudiced judge. If we're going to bet our lives on justice, let's bet on the kind that might actually exist." Clara nodded slowly, though her heart was breaking at the thought of leaving their home. "When do we leave?" "Tonight. We travel fast and light get to Denver before word spreads that we're coming." Ronan's expression was grim but determined. "Pack only what you can't replace. Your mother's jewelry, your father's papers, things with real value." "What about the sheep?" "Jim Morrison is a good neighbor. He'll see they're cared for until we get back." The certainty in his voice, not if we get back, but when, helped steady Clara's nerves. Ronan believed they could win this fight, and his confidence was infectious. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for a journey that might end with their vindication or their execution. Clara packed her few precious possessions, while Ronan cached supplies and weapons in hiding places around the ranch. If they returned, they would need resources. If they didn't, at least their enemies wouldn't benefit from their preparations. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Clara took one last look around the cabin that had become their first real home together. The bullet holes in the walls had been patched but not painted over, scars that would always remind them of the night they had chosen each other completely. The kitchen table her father had built bore gouges from Jake Mullins' spurs, and the front door hung slightly crooked from being blown off its hinges. It wasn't much to look at, but it was theirs. The place where two strangers had become husband and wife, where a marriage of convenience had transformed into something real and lasting. "We'll be back," Ronan said quietly, appearing beside her with their packed saddlebags. "Promise." Instead of answering with words, Ronan drew Clara into his arms and kissed her with a passion that spoke of desperate love and unshakable determination. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I promise," he whispered. "We've come too far to lose everything now." They rode through the night under a canopy of stars that seemed to stretch forever across the Wyoming sky. Clara had never been more than 50 miles from her father's ranch, but she sat her horse with the same steady determination that had carried her through every other crisis. Beside her, Ronan navigated by starlight and instinct, following trails that existed more in memory than reality. They spoke little during that long ride, saving their energy for the horses and the uncertain future ahead. But Clara found comfort in the sound of Ronan's breathing, the creak of leather and jingle of harness, the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going, even in the darkest night. Dawn found them at a way station 20 miles southeast of their ranch, a rough collection of buildings that served travelers on the Denver road. Clara was bone-tired and saddle-sore, but she managed to smile for the station keeper who emerged to greet them. "Morning, folks. You're up early for travelers." "Business in Denver," Ronan said simply. "Can we get fresh horses and breakfast?" "Sure can. Coffee's hot, and my wife makes biscuits that'll make you weep with joy." The station keeper was right about the biscuits, and the hot coffee helped drive away some of Clara's exhaustion. But even as she ate, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Nothing she could point to specifically, just the prickle between her shoulder blades that her father had taught her never to ignore. "Ronan," she said quietly, "something's not right." He had obviously felt it too, because his hand was already resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "How many men? 2, maybe 3, watching us from the barn." Ronan's eyes flicked toward the structure in question, taking in angles and distances with the automatic precision of a born fighter. "Station keeper's nervous too. Keeps looking toward the barn like he's expecting trouble." The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. They knew we'd come this way. "Judge Harrison's people," Ronan agreed grimly. "Probably offered a bounty for information about our movements." They were trapped. 3 armed men between them and their horses, an unknown number of others possibly covering the other approaches to the station. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she considered their options. "Can we fight our way out?" she whispered. "Maybe, but not without getting you killed in the process." The station keeper approached their table with obvious reluctance, his face pale and sweating despite the cool morning air. "Folks, I'm real sorry about this, but there's some men here want to talk to you." "What men?" Clara asked, though she already knew. "Territorial deputies, they got papers." The barn door opened and 3 men emerged, all wearing badges and carrying rifles. At their head was a tall, thin man with dead eyes and the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself very seriously. He approached their table with the swaggering confidence of someone who believed the law was on his side. "Mrs. Blackhawk," he said with mocking courtesy, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Blackhawk, I'm Deputy Marshal William Hayes, acting on behalf of Territorial Judge Harrison." Clara noticed he didn't mention any relation to her family name, which was probably coincidental, but felt like a slap in the face anyway. "We're traveling to Denver on business," Ronan said calmly. "Is there a problem?" "I'm afraid so. You're both wanted for questioning in connection with the deaths of 8 men at your ranch 3 nights ago." Hayes smiled coldly. "Judge Harrison is very interested in hearing your side of the story." "I'll bet he is," Clara muttered. Hayes's smile widened. "Smart mouth, just like I heard. Don't worry, Mrs. Blackhawk. The judge will cure you of that particular habit." Ronan's hand tightened on his gun butt, and Clara could see the violence gathering in his green eyes like storm clouds. She reached over and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Easy," she whispered. "Now then," Hayes continued, "you can come along peaceful-like, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Clara looked around the station, taking in the odds. 3 deputies, all armed and alert. The station keeper and his wife both obviously terrified and wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Ronan coiled like a spring and ready to fight despite the impossible odds. And then she heard something that changed everything. The sound of approaching horses moving fast and coming from the direction of their ranch. Hayes heard it too, his confident expression wavering slightly. "Tom, go see who that is." One of the deputies moved toward the window, his rifle ready. What he saw made him curse with surprise. "Boss, it's a whole damn posse. Maybe 15 men coming hard." Through the window, Clara could see Jim Morrison leading a group of their neighbors, all armed and riding with the grim determination of men who had come to settle accounts. Behind them rode Doc Henley, Pete Morrison, Frank Peters, and a dozen other settlers who had apparently decided that justice was more important than politics. Hayes was beginning to look less confident. What the hell do they want? I imagine they want to escort us safely to Denver, Clara said with a smile that was all teeth. You see, Deputy Hayes, these folks know the difference between self-defense and murder. They also know the difference between justice and prejudice. Jim Morrison's voice carried clearly across the station yard. Hayes, we know you're in there. Come out and let's talk like civilized men. Hayes looked trapped, which Clara realized he was. He could arrest her and Ronan, but not without fighting through a superior force of angry settlers. He could retreat, but that would mean admitting defeat and probably losing his job. This is irregular, he said weakly. So is arresting innocent people, Ronan replied. But irregularities seem to be popular with territorial courts these days. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Jim Morrison made the decision for everyone. He dismounted and walked into the station with the easy confidence of a man who knew he held the winning hand. Morning, Hayes, he said pleasantly. Heard you were planning to escort the Blackhawks to see Judge Harrison. That's right, they're wanted for questioning. Questioning about what defending their home against murderers and thieves. Jim's voice hardened. Because that's all they did, Hayes. Every man in this territory knows it. The judge will determine what they did or didn't do. No, Jim said quietly. The judge will railroad a good man because of the color of his skin and the blood in his veins. We all know Harrison's reputation. Hayes's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. You're interfering with territorial law enforcement. I'm exercising my rights as a citizen to see that my neighbors get fair treatment. Jim's smile was cold as winter. Besides, I hear there's a federal marshal in Denver who's real interested in talking to the Blackhawks about Jake Mullins and his gang. Seems Jake was robbing federal mail, which makes this a federal case. The color drained from Hayes's face. Federal jurisdiction trumped territorial authority, and everyone in the room knew it. You don't have proof of that, he said desperately. Actually, we do. Doc Henley entered the station carrying a leather pouch that Clara recognized as mail sack. Found this buried behind Jake's campsite, full of opened letters and money orders, all stolen from federal post offices. Hayes stared at the evidence with the expression of a man watching his career collapse in real time. Without federal backing, his arrest warrants were worthless. Without territorial jurisdiction, Judge Harrison's prejudices were irrelevant. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, it is, Clara said firmly. Marshal Cross will hear our case in federal court with federal law and federal justice. You and Judge Harrison can find someone else to railroad. Hayes and his deputies left the way station with considerably less swagger than they had arrived with. Clara watched them ride away and felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Thank you, she said to Jim Morrison. All of you. I don't know how we can ever repay this. You already did, Jim replied. When you and Ronan stood up to the Mullins gang, you protected all of us. This is just neighbors helping neighbors. The ride to Denver took 3 more days, but it felt like a victory parade rather than a journey to judgment. Clara and Ronan traveled in the center of a protective convoy of friends and neighbors, all determined to see that justice was done. Marshal Samuel Cross turned out to be exactly what his reputation suggested. A man in his 50s with graying hair, keen eyes, and the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making difficult decisions. He listened to their story without interruption, examined the evidence with careful attention, and asked pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of both the law and the realities of frontier life. Mrs. Blackhawk, he said finally, your husband killed 8 men in defense of his home and family. Under federal law, that's not only justified, it's expected. No grand jury in this territory would vote to indict a man for protecting his wife from murderers and thieves. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "So we're free. You're free," Cross confirmed. "More than that, you're heroes." Jake Mullins and his gang had been terrorizing this territory for over a year. The federal government owes you a debt of gratitude. The relief was so overwhelming that Clara nearly collapsed. Ronan's arm around her shoulders was the only thing that kept her upright as the reality of their vindication sank in. They were free. They were innocent. They could go home. The journey back to their ranch was everything the ride to Denver had not been. Relaxed, celebratory, full of laughter and shared stories. Their neighbors had not only escorted them to justice, they had also used the time to organize barn-raising parties and work crews to repair the damage from the battle with the Mullins gang. When Clara and Ronan crested the final ridge and saw their home spread out below them, she gasped with amazement. The cabin had been completely repaired with new windows, a freshly painted door, and a stone chimney that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The barn had been expanded, new corrals had been built, and their sheep grazed contentedly in pastures that showed signs of careful tending. "Welcome home," Jim Morrison said with a satisfied smile. "Hope you don't mind. We took a few liberties while you were gone." Clara was crying too hard to speak. She slid from her horse and ran toward the cabin, pushing through the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to welcome them home. The interior was even more amazing than the exterior. New furniture, fresh curtains, a kitchen stove that was twice the size of their old one, and everywhere, the signs of careful attention from people who cared. "How?" she finally managed to ask. "Community effort," Doc Henley said gruffly. "Figured if we were going to have heroes living among us, they deserved a hero's welcome." That evening, as their neighbors finally dispersed and Clara and Ronan found themselves alone in their transformed home, they stood on the front porch looking out over land that suddenly felt more like home than it ever had before. "So," Clara said, slipping her hand into Ronan's, "what happens now? Now we live." He replied simply, "We raise sheep, we plant crops, we build a life together. We have children and watch them grow up on this land. We grow old together, and when our time comes, we're buried side by side under that cottonwood tree where our marriage began." Clara smiled through happy tears. "That sounds perfect." Under the vast Wyoming sky, with stars beginning to appear overhead like diamonds scattered on velvet, the Shepherdess and the Apache stood together at the threshold of their real life. Their marriage had begun with ancient law, and desperate necessity had survived violence and prejudice and the threat of legal murder, and had emerged stronger than either of them had dared to hope. As Ronan drew Clara into his arms for a kiss that tasted of promise, and forever she marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first day when a stranger had saved her from bandits and accidentally seen her uncovered through all the trials and dangers and misunderstandings, they had somehow found their way to real love, real partnership, real happiness. "By the law of my people, you must marry me," she had declared that first day, never knowing that she was pronouncing words that would change both their lives forever. Now, as they stood together in the doorway of their home, surrounded by the evidence of a community's acceptance and support, Clara understood that the best laws were not written in books or carved in stone. The best laws were written in the human heart, in the decision to love someone completely and stand by them no matter what storms might come. The Shepherdess and the Apache had found their happy ending not through the accident of that first uncovering, but through the daily choice to honor, protect, and cherish each other. Their love story had begun with biblical law and frontier necessity, but it had grown into something much more precious. A partnership that could weather any storm, face any challenge, overcome any obstacle. As they stepped across the threshold of their home together, Clara knew that their real adventure was just beginning. There would be children to raise, land to work, neighbors to help, and 1,000 small daily choices to make their marriage stronger and deeper with each passing year. But tonight, with the stars shining overhead and love warming them both from within the future, looked as bright and endless as the Wyoming sky itself. They had come through the fire together, and they were stronger for it. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it as they had faced everything else. Together with courage, with love, and with the unshakable knowledge that they had found in each other the missing piece of their own souls. The story of the Shepherdess and the Apache had become legend in their own lifetime, proof that love could conquer any obstacle, bridge any divide, overcome any prejudice. But for Clara and Ronan Blackhawk, it was simply the beginning of the rest of their lives together, written in the language of the heart, and sealed with a love that would endure until the end of time.